Welcome back to The Real Story with Jeannie Ives. On a Zoom interview with me is Matt Crouch. You've heard from him before, and he's coming on for a different topic, one that deals with one of the states that he helps do political work for, or actually policy work for, and that is Missouri. And so Matt Crouch, if you don't remember, he is the regional coordinator for the Lower Midwest for Heritage Action for America. He is also a former Marine Corps officer and a Naval Academy graduate. So other than December, Matt and I really do get along mostly on policy. And so he's coming to us today. He's on the road, by the way. He works for three different states on working with the Sentinel program for Heritage for America. He is there to actually also advocate for policy, and he does a lot of the policy work in both Missouri and Arkansas. He is not a lobbyist in Illinois, but he does understand what's happening policy-wise in Illinois. We come to him today for a very specific topic, one that Josh Hawley raised awareness about this week. And I'm going to set the stage for the conversation by first introducing you to what we are going to talk about. This is, of course, about the transgender surgeries that have been happening at a St. Louis hospital, unbeknownst to a lot of folks, and it's been happening with minor children. There has been a whistleblower who has come forward to tell people exactly what's going on. Let me tell you what she revealed. She wrote this in the Free Press, and it came out on February 9th. The title, "I thought I was saving trans kids, now I'm blowing the whistle." And it is a expose by Jamie Reed. She is blowing the whistle about what's going on. And here's what she starts with. She says, "I'm a 42-year-old St. Louis native, a queer woman, and politically to the left of Bernie Sanders. My worldview has deeply shaped my career. I have spent my professional life providing counseling to vulnerable populations, children in foster care, sexual minorities, the poor. For almost 4 years, I worked at the Washington University School of Medicine Division of Infectious Diseases with teens and young adults who were HIV positive. Many of them were trans or otherwise gender nonconforming, and I could relate. Through childhood and adolescence, I did a lot of gender questioning myself. I'm now married to a trans man, and together we are raising 2 biological children from a previous marriage and 3 foster children we hope to adopt." So let's set the stage here. She's an ally of the entire trans movement, and she's yet blowing the whistle. Let me continue. "During the 4 years I worked at the clinic as a case manager, I was responsible for patient intake and oversight. Around 1,000 distressed young children came through the doors. The majority of them received hormone prescriptions that can have life-altering consequences, including sterility. I left the clinic in November of last year because I could no longer participate in what was happening there. By the time I departed, I was certain that the way the American medical system is treating these patients is the opposite of the promise we made to do no harm. Instead, we are permanently harming the vulnerable patients in our care." Her article goes on and on. Again, you can read it at the Free Press. You can read it, Jamie Reed. You Google that, it's going to come up. Let me give you a couple more insights, though. She says, this is, I think, very interesting. "At first, the patient population was tipped toward what used to be the traditional instance of child with gender dysphoria, a boy, often quite young, who wanted to present as, or who wanted to be, a girl." This is her writing this. "Until 2015 or so, a very small number of these boys comprised the population of pediatric gender dysphoria cases. Then across the Western world, there began to be a dramatic increase in a new population. Teenage girls, many with no previous history of gender distress, suddenly declared they were transgender and demanded immediate treatment with testosterone. The girls who came to us had many comorbidities: depression, anxiety, ADHD, eating disorders, obesity. Many were diagnosed with autism or had autism-like symptoms. A report last year on the British Pediatric Transgender Center found that about 1/3 of the patients referred there were on the autism spectrum. These are not well children who should be transitioned," is her point. "Frequently, our patients declared they had disorders that no one believed they had. We had patients who said they had Tourette's syndrome, but they didn't. They had tic disorders, but they didn't. They had multiple personalities, but they didn't. The doctors privately recognized these false self-diagnoses as a manifestation of a social contagion. They even acknowledged that suicide has an element of social contagion. But when I said the clusters of girls streaming to our service looked as if their gender issues might be a manifestation of social contagion, the doctor said gender identity reflected something innate. So she's blowing the whistle. She's an ally of the trans movement. She's blowing the whistle. That same day that this report came out, this is the February 9th whistleblower report in the Free People, February 9th. That same day, Josh Hawley immediately began an investigation of this. And he says, we're not going to stand for this. Starting immediately, he wrote to the institutions, your institutions must take steps to preserve all records, written and electronic, regarding gender-related treatments performed on minors since the opening of the center. The senator wrote, additional oversight, inquiries, and outreach will follow. He also mentioned this, and I think this is really important for folks, especially if you live in Illinois. Pay attention right now. Josh Hawley wrote, this report builds on recent revelations that the center counseled educational authorities to conceal information from parents regarding their children's cross-gender identification. On January 17, 2023, news reports indicated that Parkway School District in St. Louis County has been concealing students' chest binding from their parents, and that the center encouraged such concealment, encouraging teachers to lie to children's parents is unconscionable. If even a fraction of the whistleblowers' new allegations is collaborated, the center should be immediately shut down. That's important to Illinoisans because it is the official policy, the official guidelines of the Illinois State Board of Education to school districts that they are not to inform parents if their children want to present as the opposite sex in school, but don't want their parents to know. Teachers, administrators, principals, school nurses, psychologists are all to stay silent. I have a problem with that. Now we bring in Matt. Matt, thank you for coming to us because Missouri, unlike Illinois, is attempting to do something about this. And that's why I wanted you in. I want you to discuss some of the legislation that they have put forth to handle this situation. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Jeannie. I really appreciate it. In fact, it was just this morning that in the Missouri Senate, they heard the first round of Senate bills that deal directly and specifically with this issue. And those are broadly often called Help Not Harm, or in the case in Missouri, they're entitled SAFE Acts. And SAFE is Save Adolescents from Experimentation. And I think it's really important to understand why this is about experimentation. This is a complicated and multifaceted problem. You mentioned the social contagion, right? You mentioned the comorbidities that were called out in that article. By no means is there anyone out there that wants to turn away children from important care that they absolutely need. The issue is with this specific type of care that's being provided, there is no evidence that it's good for the children. And what it represents as they walk them down a road from social transition into surgeries that can barely be called that. You might even go so far as to describe them as mutilations to alter their bodies permanently, and into a variety of drugs, whether those be puberty blockers or hormones. They're cross-sex hormones. They're doing irreversible things to these children, and there is no indication that there's any good in the long-term medical outcome for these patients, and there's no data backing these procedures as being positive. So they really are in real time trying things and seeing what the outcomes are and finding out and readjusting. So I don't know how else you would define an experiment. And that's exactly what we find out across the country, and why legislatures like those in Texas and Alabama, Arkansas, and Florida have taken steps already. And in Missouri, they're beginning to do the same thing. And so SB 49 in particular is a bill that we're tracking in Missouri. It has a couple of other companion bills that are very similar in language. And what they all essentially seek to do is based off the Arkansas model is stop the mutilation of the children from a physical medical procedure standpoint, and at the same time prevent the use of the puberty blocking and cross hormone drugs that, again, there's no indications, there are no long-term longitudinal studies that suggest that they would have a positive long-term medical outcome for these children. And in fact, what studies we do have, and I would mention the Heritage Foundation study by Dr. Jay Green from the University of Arkansas, one of our Heritage Foundation's experts. What it actually shows is that in states where there's a policy to make the cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers readily available, in contrast to those states where that is not the case and they are restricted, you actually see a 14% increase in suicide rates in these patients. So if anything, the knowledge that we have garnered through exacting study shows us that it's a worse outcome for these kids, not the other.
So, I mean, that's the great thing about Heritage Foundation. You can find everything from an assessment of our military capabilities to discussions about the cultural issues of the day, including the trans surgeries that have been going on. I mean, this is not new, and this is news to anybody, right? They already had the Tavistock Clinic in Great Britain, basically 1,000 parents suing them over the types of hormone blockers they've been giving children over there. They completely shut down their entire experiment on children's. I don't understand what's wrong with Americans. I mean, the fact that this was even a fight in South Dakota, where certain South Dakota state representatives, I mean, South Dakota is considered a fairly conservative state. They have similar legislation going through their process right now. And yet there were legislators who would not vote to protect children. This is about protecting children. What do you see is going to happen in Missouri with this legislation? What's your prediction?
Well, I would expect that this legislation is going to move forward and on to passage. I think what the article that you mentioned from the Free Press that exposes the clinic at Washington University in St. Louis demonstrates is that contrary to what proponents of this type of medical procedure would advocate, there is not really a standard of care out there. Right? So not only is there no justification for it from a long-term longitudinal study perspective, but there's also not an industry-wide standard that's being followed. There's no test or there's no assessment that you could count on being used everywhere that's going to say, yeah, this individual does need to move forward with this type of medical care. It's largely self-identified by the patient. And unfortunately, as is the case with many things in the industry, there's a profit motive underlying this that's frightening. And you can read about some of the abuses of that went on, for example, at Vanderbilt University in their hospital, right? That they have been forced by action by the people and actions by the legislature to stop doing these surgeries on children. But once you walk down the road as a patient, what you're signing yourself up for is a lifetime of drug treatment, a lifetime of pain, a lifetime of problems. And there are ample examples of people who have received this care in the past who are living with regret and living with medical conditions that will make them forever dependent on some type of medical service provider that is going to cash in on that fact. And so the human wastage that's left behind in the wake of what I would call a liberal progressive agenda is just devastating. And whether it's young women like Chloe Clark who look back and say, I was taken advantage of, I was rushed through the treatment too quickly from one very simple interview onto life-altering procedures and life-altering drugs, and now I can never be what I was fully intended to be, or whether it's detransitioners like Walt Heyer, who were
Yes.
at the cutting edge of this
Hmm.
in the last century and have come to realize how dehumanizing the entire process is, and have become advocates for putting the brakes on. What we know for sure is that our children are better off to have these decisions made by their parents. And one of the key elements of this legislation and other legislation like it that we at Heritage are big advocates for are empowering the parents and the Parents' Bill of Rights. And so as you
Okay.
look at the,
Is there
go
any,
ahead, please.
so some people though, okay, great, that's great. We're going to stop it going forward. But is there any mechanism in this legislation to fine, decertify medical doctors, professionals who have done harm to children, who have taken an autistic child and essentially performed an experiment on them? Are we going to get to an accountability phase with this, or is it just on a going forward basis? Because I've about had it with some of the abuses I've seen in the medical clinic, medical profession, everything from mandatory vaccinations for COVID, which now Fauci is revealing he knew ahead of time that the mRNA vaccines were not going to be able to help with any coronavirus because coronaviruses don't respond to vaccines. Well, he never said that 2 years ago. So my point is like there feels like there's no accountability. And by the way, the pharmaceuticals industry is providing the drugs that are allowing this type of transitioning to go forward. I mean, do they have a role in this for
Well,
accountability?
I think in terms of accountability, what you can see typically in this type of legislation will be uh, three specific remedies that are offered. The first would be a mechanism to punish from the state with some kind of decertification, where if they identify violations, you could de-license the medical practitioners and providers. And the second you would find is a private right to action for the minor that's affected, or if they remain a minor, then that would private right of action passes on to their parent or guardian to be able to take action. And I think that the third thing that you see oftentimes as an enforcement mechanism in this is where the state makes steps to go after the provider and treat it as though it were abuse. So it's in addition to the decertification or delicensing and the punishments that would come with that, you may also find in legislation where they're calling this type of treatment of minors child abuse, and that opens up a different avenue, a criminal avenue for them to go after
Okay, so
the people who are perpetrating this.
well, that's interesting because what if it is the psycho parent who is like all in for this? I mean, you have an issue here. One, you have a number of cases that have risen across the United States where you've got a divorced couple and they are fighting over whether or not their child can receive puberty blockers and hormone treatments and even further things. And they're starting at even a young age having these discussions. And some people want to take their children now to California because it's a sanctuary for this type of abuse of children. And so you've got those instances where I think the law needs to step in. Not to mention, I mean, I don't know how this is any different than like beating your kid. I find it abusive. If they're 18 and they want to do something foolish, whatever. But quite frankly, we have so many laws that protect minors. Like in the state of Illinois, you can go ahead and get an abortion if you're a minor without your parents knowing. Guess what you can't do? You can't go to a suntanning salon. You can't get a tattoo. You can't get your ears pierced. I mean, there's a number of things that are far more benign than taking hormones. You can't do it without parents knowing. And so now you're at something that literally is irreversible. I think it's on the order of abuse. is there anything in the legislation that says you can't do and you can't make a decision on this until you're past the age of 18, or do psycho parents still get to make these decisions for their children?
So in the legislation we've been talking about, it explicitly bans these type of
Okay.
mutilative procedures for minors. So at least
Okay.
within the state in question, that whether the parent were to decide that they needed to move forward with that care or not, that wouldn't be an option because it's just not
Okay.
legal inside the state. But to your earlier point, right, there is a complication, and I think we see this in similarly in the case where you're talking about who is the victim of an abortion, right? Obviously, it's the child, but in many cases, it's also the mother who's been tricked or
Hmm.
fooled. And I think that when you look at this issue of transgender and the kind of surgeries that are being done, oftentimes what's happening is the parents are being fooled. They're being presented a fait accompli. They've had their child at school, like you mentioned in Illinois, right, who has made a statement, perhaps because their friend has decided to identify in a certain way. You know, the fact of the matter is they find that within a single friend group, for every one individual that identifies as something other than their sex at birth, there's about 4 other friends that will then adopt that position. Right? So maybe they've done that and they're at a school where unfortunately the counselors are hiding that from the parent and helping the child start to go by a different name, start to use different pronouns, and begin to live their life in a different way, completely unbeknownst to their parents. And then suddenly 6 months down the road, they're presented with, well, your child is going to commit suicide if you don't continue to support them in this life change
Hmm.
that they shouldn't really be making because their brain isn't finished fully developing. But what are your choices? Kill your child, force them into suicide,
Hmm.
or walk down this horrific road of bodily mutilation and a lifetime of drug treatments. So,
Not to
and there are
mention,
some things that
well
can be
over
done about that.
yeah, 90% of the children who do present as having gender dysphoria in their minor years, they outgrow this by the time they're in their late teens. It is a phase.
Absolutely. 61 to 98% in the studies that are available show that they adjust to their own body and go on to lead their lives
Mhm.
as they were born. And it presents this problem that you have to address with what the schools are doing. And part of the way that you go about that, right, is you develop a parent's bill of rights within your state, which forces transparency on the school, puts the parents in charge of the medical decisions, right, and ensures that it's not the minor, but the responsible parent that's making the choices along the way about what's best for the child and the child's medical care. And you can further address this with something called a Given Name Act, where by law, the schools are required to use the name that the child was given on the birth certificate. And if they want to do something other, they actually would have to seek the permission of the parents in order to do that. And so the multifaceted approach, but what it essentially does is you stop the schools from hiding the social transition, you stop the social transition from happening, and you kind of cut off this walk from, oh, I'm going to use a new name and I'm not going to tell my parents, to getting surgery and, as I said, making a life altering decision that you really shouldn't make
Matt,
on your own.
this is terrific information. You're so good with the data and the background and the stories. This is really good information. I hope everybody's paying attention. I'm going to provide you a little bit of additional information. So this is already a problem in the state of Illinois. In 2019, a man named Jay Keck wrote in USA Today about his daughter who was on the autistic spectrum, and at a very wealthy school district, Hinsdale School District 86. She was allowed to transition while in school, despite the parents' protestations against it, despite them going in and telling them, you are not to call her by a different name. You are to call her by her given name. You are not to give her different pronouns. You are not to allow her to dress differently. We oppose all of that. The school, behind the parents' back, did it anyway. Started to go down this road. So folks who are listening to this podcast, you need to understand these school districts are out of control in the state of Illinois. My own daughter at Wheaton Warrenville South was asked by her English teacher to fill out a form saying, getting to know you. She was asked, third question down, what are your pronouns? What the hell is that? That is going behind the parents' back to start to find out if this child wants to be something other than what the parents have decided. It is going behind the parents' back to ask them on any questionnaire items like that. And of course, me, I called them right away and said, you're not going to be doing this. But I'm not the only one who needs to be calling. Everybody needs to be calling. This is happening in the state of Illinois. Their official guidance, again, is that they can socially transition your kid behind your back and not even tell you. It's a problem. What's Arkansas doing about this?
So Arkansas last year passed a SAFE Act that outlaws all of that sort of experimentation that we discussed about. And this session, I expect that you'll see some things moving forward there that reinforce what I mentioned earlier, the Parents' Bill of Rights. And it's interesting that you bring up the schools, because the schools really lie at the intersection of a variety of problems, which really come down to, is their role to educate or is their role to indoctrinate? And increasingly we find a problem with the indoctrination. And that's one of the things that's critical about seeking a Parents' Bill of Rights, because a Parents' Bill of Rights does put the parent in charge. It puts the onus on the school to be transparent. And transparency is key, is it allows parents like you, Jeannie, to jump in and say, hey, what curriculum are you using? What are you teaching my children? Why are you showing them these types of videos or asking them to read these types of books? And it puts the authority where it rightly belongs, on the shoulders of the parents. And this is cross-cutting along a variety of topics, and really gets down to allowing the parent to make a choice about whether they're going to keep their child at that school. And of course, that launches off into one of our other priority issues of education choice, and why it's so important for parents to be able to, one, know what's going on at the school, but then have options if it's a problem. And all of these things and resources that deal with the way in which indoctrination has crept into education, whether it has to do with this transgender issue or CRT, all that's available from our saveourschools.com website. And I would recommend that parents who are interested, and taxpayers who are interested in understanding some of the problems that happen across the country, and maybe in your school district as it relates to this, they can find resources there that will help explain that and the kinds of things that can be done.
Okay, that's terrific, because I want to double back on that in two ways. One, I want to, again, tell our listeners, listen, we're having Ian Pryor out for an event March 14th. You can go to our website, breakthrough-ideas.com, sign up for it. Ian Pryor is one of the Loudoun County parents who basically took on their school board and won. We call it, the title of ours is Taking on the School Board Bullies and Winning, because that's what they have become in many cases, many of your school board members. So we're talking about winning these. It's really important that folks understand that there is an election coming up April 4th in the state of Illinois, where you will be deciding on who your school board members are. They can make a huge impact on your child's life, positively or negatively. So pay attention to that. But let's get back to school choice, which is the other thing that I want to talk to you about, because we just saw Iowa and Utah just in January both passed educational savings accounts that are universal, that essentially say we're going to fund students and not systems, that are such of amount that these students can and these families can get their kids out of bad public schools and transition them into, charter schools or private schools of their choice or parochial schools. And so that is the way of the future, I think, for everybody. I've heard that Arkansas might be on the list to go the same way. I think there's about a dozen states that are going to take this up, hopefully this year, in their state legislatures. Can you speak a little bit more to that? Where's Missouri on this? Do you see Arkansas moving forward with this process? I think Sarah Sanders mentioned it in her rebuttal to the Biden address.
She absolutely did, and I've actually had opportunity to hear Governor Sanders speak a couple of times in different venues, and she is absolutely moving forward with an entire revamp of the state of Arkansas educational program. And within that is going to be a kind of ESA program, which they plan to ramp up over the course of 3 years from a needs tested basis to open to everyone universally. Now, as it stands, the bills, one in the Senate, one in the House, that she's working with, have not been released publicly.
Okay.
But they're very close to that. And my expectation is that we'll see that education omnibus bill come out over the course of this week. And it'll be the traditional legislative process where they work back and forth to sort of find what is the right language that everybody is comfortable with. But what was clear from her press conference in announcing this last week is that they've really got momentum in Arkansas. They've got folks on board from across the government, from across the profession, and they're going to do a whole variety of things to improve education, including upping the average teacher pay significantly and the beginning salaries significantly. So it's really it appears that there'll be a holistic approach, but at the center of it is going to be more school choice for the parents. So we're looking forward to seeing that when it comes out, and seeing what we might be able to do to help with that. In Missouri, I think the big movement on education is going to be a little less ambitious than that, and it's going to have more to do with expanding open enrollment this session.
Okay.
But we have high hopes that over time in Missouri, they'll be able to build to a point where they also expand their ESA program beyond the limited one that they have now to one that is more inclusive.
Well, that's great. I mean, listen, we need these other states to set the example for bad actors like the state of Illinois that is heavily, the legislatures is bought off by the public sector unions. And so we need other good examples out there so that, people can see how well those systems work. So that's the value in it. Before we leave you, because I don't get to often have a conversation with you, Matt, and you've got such a breadth of knowledge about what's going on in other states. And we do care about Missouri specifically because it's a border state to Illinois. We need to know what our neighbors are doing. And so is there any other, on the spectrum of legislation, is there anything that you find just interesting that you wanted to tell us about that's going on in either Arkansas or Missouri that maybe we want to, pay attention to here in Illinois? Is there, a tax policy or something that you're interested in?
Well, I think one of the things that we're always interested in wherever we go at Heritage is ensuring that there's confidence in the electoral process and there's election integrity. I think one of the most interesting things that's going on right now across the country and was recently defeated in Missouri prior to the last election as ranked choice voting.
Oh, yep.
So, fully anticipate that we'll see ranked choice voting, as we've seen it in other places, crop up as a potential issue across the country. I think what's important for folks to understand on ranked choice voting is that there's really not a good version of it. It's oftentimes overly complicated. It's frequently something that ends it up in a less than optimal outcome from the perspective of the voter, and in that sense feels like a disenfranchisement, because frankly it is. We've had a long tradition in this country of the one versus one binary choice. The voter makes their pick, and then that individual who wins advances from that primary into the general. And I think we've seen pretty convincingly, for example, out in California, where they institute ranked choice voting and end up producing a result that is actually even the wrong result, that was only possible at the county level out in California because the tabulation process is convoluted, and you end up certifying an election that, even according to your own rules, is not the correct winner. And I think that that's just the tip of the iceberg with the problems for ranked choice voting. And to be blunt about it, the folks who are behind advocating for it are sort of the same cast of bad actors that we're used to seeing coming out of the left, right? It's folks like George Soros that are bankrolling organizations to go out and just fundamentally change the way that Americans interact with each other, their government, and underneath the Constitution.
Sure, George Soros, who famously, supported Kim Foxx and her grasp to basically make Chicago a criminal free zone, actually a criminal's haven, really. So he's a problem. Speaking of ranked choice voting, though, and then I'll end this podcast, which is getting probably a little long. I don't know if you know, but we have the craziest congressperson in the entire United States, resides right here in the state of Illinois. You're probably shocked by that because you'd think it'd be New York or California. It's really not. No, it's Sean Casten. He is literally the craziest congressperson up there. He actually suggested expanding the U.S. Senate by 12 members elected at large by ranked choice voting across the United States.
Well, I think even just a cursory understanding of the Constitution and why the Senate was built the way it was built is enough to understand how bad of an idea that would be.
The guy doesn't care about the Constitution. I'm going to call him unconstitutional Casten. I mean, I think that's my new name for him. That's not even crazy unconstitutional Casten. I mean, he basically wants to rip apart the Constitution. This also includes changing out how the judiciary is presented. It also includes, I think, adding 135 new congressmen. So, I mean, the guy's he's out in left field. But yeah, that was his idea. Okay, well, thank you so much, Matt, about coming on to my podcast. Great information from you. Again, folks, if you go to heritage.org, you can get a lot of this information, whether it's talking about the SAFE Act and transitioning people. Go to, I think you said it was Dr. Jay Green, who had information on the transgender issue. You can go there. You can look at what they've done with assessing our U.S. military, which something Matt and I also want to have a conversation about, to talk about election integrity with Hans von Spakovsky. He's an election expert on this issue. So lots of good information from Heritage. Matt, thank you so much for coming on The Real Story with Jeannie Ives.